Hello and welcome to the latest Science of Sport podcast. I'm your host, Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Sam Thompson. So Sam is currently finishing off his PhD with Celtic Football Club, and he's living in Valencia in Spain. He's an exercise nutritionist, and he's here today to discuss how you can improve performance using a vegetarian and vegan diet. So without further ado, it's time to welcome Sam onto the show. So Sam, welcome to the Science of Sport podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thank you very much for joining us. So can you give us a quick introduction as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
Sure. So my name's Sam Thompson. I am a sport and exercise nutritionist. I came through, I suppose, what is probably a traditional pathway where I was interested in sport, went to university, played at a reasonably decent level for kind of football and a few other sports within university. Being in Edinburgh, shortly realised that my eating habits and eating behaviours were horrendous, to say the least.
I did.
I don't know if you ever tried deep fried margarine in...
Not mate, but no.
Obviously not advising that now. when I lacked a bit of nutrition knowledge, obviously dietary behaviours and stuff were pretty rare. But that kind of drove my interest in that from a personal perspective. Okay, well, how does that, how can I learn more about sports science and nutrition and exercise to improve my own performance? Went on and did a master's in Northumbria, and came up and started working straight off the bat with clients from kind of general population all the way through to professional athletes and semi-professional athletes. Really enjoyed that aspect of it in terms of working with the athletes. I moved back to Edinburgh later on. I was fortunate enough to get a chance to go into Hibernian Football Club, work with the nutritionists there, and then from there an opportunity came about to go through and work for Celtic as the nutritionist in Celtic alongside doing a PhD in nutrition for football essentially. And then finished that in January just gone, and so now it's basically just at the point of writing a PhD.
Awesome, and a nice little move to Valencia you mentioned as well.
Yes, a nice little move over to the sun, and I'm definitely not ever moving back to the UK.
Excellent, well deserved, mate. Well deserved. So obviously we're here to discuss diets and specifically like a vegetarian and vegan diet. So before we get into how that impacts sport and all that kind of stuff, can you give us a quick outline of those two diets and what that means?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose when we think about kind of vegan or vegetarian diets, they probably fall into this wider category, which I would term plant-based diets, which is essentially the vast majority of the food you consume comes from plant sources. Now, within that, we have a range of different plant-based diets and different diets that include, obviously, animal products and plant-based products. So, for example, one of the biggest kind of rises recently, I think, that we've seen, not just among athletes, but among the general population, is this idea of flexitarian, where you still might consume little bits of animal products, but for the vast majority of your diet is plant-based diet, plant-based food. Vegan and vegetarian are probably the more traditional type of plant-based approach. The vegetarian diet where we don't consume any kind of animal products in terms of meat or fish, but we would include things like dairy, so milk, yogurt, that kind of thing. Vegan diets, on the other hand, would exclude all animal-based products. And that's not just necessarily from a food perspective, although we obviously factor that in as nutritionists, but they would also avoid any kind of animal products, so things like clothing or shoes or whatever, they would try and avoid that completely. But yeah, so I suppose vegetarian and vegan are probably more the traditional kind of plant-based diets that we see, but there's certainly others that can incorporate different food groups. And I suppose we'll talk about this in a little bit when we talk about some of the challenges and kind of the pros, how when we're working with athletes we might want to factor that in.
Yeah, so let's go into that straight away. Like, what are the advantages? Because obviously, people are doing it. There's a reason behind it. So, what's the thought process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously in the last few years, the interest in this kind of diet approach, whether it be from ethical or environmental or health or whatever the kind of motivating factor is for going down this path, we've seen certainly within athlete populations a rise massively in how many athletes are actually undertaking this. So there are a few advantages certainly that we can think of when we're talking about. We'll talk about this probably more from a vegetarian approach, and then we'll highlight some of the nuances of that as well. But if we think about it just from a kind of a purely kind of pragmatic standpoint, if we're thinking about the types of foods that we exclude when we remove meat and fish and that kind of thing, what it leaves us with is essentially a high carbohydrate diet. And we see this in the literature when we're working with athletes. What we see a lot of the times is that athletes will remove maybe animal-based products and replace that with things like whatever it might be. So pasta, rice, things that they're already normally consuming. They might just have that in larger quantities. And so when we're thinking about athlete performance and the importance of carbohydrate, then obviously that can be an advantage straight off the bat. We know that a lot of athletes don't eat enough carbohydrate. And so taking that into a plant-based diet where they increase their carbohydrate intake, we can see a kind of positive benefit there. The other side of it is obviously that we know that a lot of plant-based carbohydrate foods come with fiber because of the way that we break down those plant-based foods themselves. And we see this again in the literature that the vast majority of athletes or general population individuals who undertake plant-based diets have or consume more fiber in their diet. So we can see that from a long-term health perspective, then there's going to be benefits there, definitely.
And is it the case that they're also consuming more vegetables? Because that's the way it always sounds, right? At least it sounds like they're going to have, I don't know, 5 to 8 portions of fruit and veg a day, and that makes it super healthy because there's loads of vitamins and minerals in there. Is that the case, or is it more a carbohydrate and macronutrient standpoint?
Sure, I mean, in theory, it should effectively work like that. Because again, if we're taking away you take away food sources that you can't eat, you're going to eat more of the ones that you can. So in theory, it should be that you eat more whole grain carbohydrates and fruits and veg. I'm not sure. The introduction of vegan Ben and Jerry's probably hasn't helped
Is
that.
that a thing?
Oh, absolutely. Maybe you never tried I think it's the vegan peanut butter cup.
Is it
Ben and
good?
Jerry's, amazing.
Really?
Yeah, amazing.
What's it made out of?
Traditionally, they're
Like
made
beans
of
or something?
just mashed beans, yeah.
Yeah, with peanut butter in it.
No, they're usually a mix of kind of soya milk, or they might have some coconut oil in there. And again, this is probably where a lot of people, when they think about vegan, vegetarian diets, and they go, well, it must be healthier. It's always important to then put it in the context of, well, we can still have a pretty low quality vegan or vegetarian diet as we can with an omnivorous diet. But certainly, if we think about the types of food and the range of foods that are available to us, and this is something that I always try and get to do with all athletes, not necessarily just vegetarian or vegan athletes, but I think with all athletes, we think about the diversity of foods that we eat, trying to expand that, certainly and especially in regard to fruits and vegetables. It just becomes not necessarily easier because that food is still available for people who eat animal-based products, but the fact that you're excluding what you previously ate is probably a large proportion of your daily intake. it just opens, I think, a little bit more of a door and a pathway to, okay, well, I'm not going to eat animal products. Let's try and expand the types of foods that we can. And so we can see some benefits from there in terms of a range of different fruits and vegetables, and that leads to benefits in terms of overall fiber intake. And then we know there's some interesting research coming out in terms of food diversity and the range of type of foods that you have on the kind of microbiota as well.
Okay, maybe that's a podcast for another day. I think it's interesting to dive
in 15
into.
minutes, that's a lot to go through.
I was going to say we're not going to get through all of that, but obviously those are the advantages. Is like pretty clear. Potentially more carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables are good for you. More diversity, that's great. What are the disadvantages? Because obviously there are good things about eating meat sources, right? Like there are certain macronutrients and certain vitamins and minerals that you get from that, which you might not be getting if you're only eating carbohydrates and vegetables.
Yeah, 100%. So obviously the big one is if you've ever been on, I don't know if you follow anyone who's kind of vegan or vegetarian on Instagram, but I'm sure
not massively. I don't think.
No, but I think any comment or any picture that you put up in all of the comment sections always, where'd you get your protein from?
Yeah,
that's just the Instagram phrase of for anyone who's vegan or vegetarian. And it is obviously a concern to a degree when we're working with athletes. I think especially if you have an athlete who transitions quickly. So, for example, in January last year, I had a couple of individual clients who wanted to just give up meat for January. And then that obviously transitioned off the back of that. But they had high energy requirements, so they required a lot of calories to maintain their sport, and a large proportion of their diet previously had been from animal products. So immediately you're cutting out a huge proportion of what their diet had entailed before, and the fact that then you're losing high quality protein sources within there. That's probably the major concern. That's where I think a lot of athletes, or if coaches who are working with athletes who are transitioning into kind of this plant-based vegetarian vegan diet, is we need to make sure that the energy lost through animal products is replaced relatively quickly. And we can do this a number of ways. I think now, especially depending on where you live, in Spain it's not great. I've got a wee story tie in there, but we'll come back to that in a second. But certainly in the UK, the popularity of these plant-based foods has gone up massively in the last few years. So that can be quite an easy way to just transition over. It's a place essentially like for like. So if you have chicken breast, you swap that for a plant-based chicken breast, and that can be quite a good way of just replacing total energy. And then in terms of protein also, we need to think about the leucine content. So that obviously drives our ability to build muscle. Animal products tend to be higher in leucine, and so we need to try and replace that within our diets through plant-based products. And usually it just means consuming more of the protein. So we see that above around like 1.6 grams per kilogram per day protein intake, that seems to level out, and we can make good gains on a plant-based diet. And alongside that, there's a few other kind of micronutrients that we need to be aware of. So things like zinc, iron, calcium, where we tend to get them from things like dairy and other animal-based foods, and they tend to have a better bioavailability absorption rate than the non-animal-based foods or plant-based foods. So yeah, within that, but the key ones I would say are probably energy and protein intake for sure.
And when we look at a vegan diet, obviously you mentioned some dairy products there, which are pretty good sources. how does that then work in a vegan diet? Because there's only so many beans and peas, nearly, you can eat, right? So how do you then, as a vegan, start to hit that 1.6, for example, grams per kilo body weight per day?
Yeah. So I think this is where careful planning comes in. So we can do it through food. And again, it depends on what your needs are. So if you think about 1.6 to 2 grams per kilogram being our kind of recommended intake of protein throughout the day, if we have a larger athlete, it becomes obviously more difficult to get that through whole food. If we have a smaller athlete, or if we have a kind of youth athlete who requires the total amount which is lower, then it can be done through food. I would say that this is where things like protein supplementation obviously come in as a positive. We don't necessarily need them, but at the same way, I wouldn't not advise taking a protein supplement to an athlete who already included animal-based products in their diet. I think from a just an ease standpoint, and a protein supplement can be really useful. And also, the problem that we tend to have with whole-based food sources coming from protein sources coming from plant foods is this digestibility issue where the amount of protein needed to stimulate this kind of muscle protein synthesis is higher, whereas in a protein supplement, it's obviously concentrated form, we can just get that easier. So yeah, I think from there, planning out meals, making sure that the amount of energy lost through removing those animal products and then just replacing that with either like for like or in a kind of meat replacement product, or using a protein supplementation can just be a really simple way of doing that.
Are there any other like pitfalls that athletes need to avoid? So let's say they're thinking about making a transition to either a predominantly plant-based or an entirely plant-based diet. Are there any other little bits and pieces you think, oh, actually make sure you consider that before you make the step, or make sure that these things are covered, because that's an important part of the process?
So again, I think that's the key message that we kind of just touched on there is, so if we are assessing our current dietary behaviors or current dietary intake, and we're thinking, right, we're going to transition into a solely plant-based, so say it's solely a vegan diet, is consider, okay, what is the kind of proportion of food that I'm getting from animal-based products? How does that translate into my total energy intake for the day? And then how can I best replace that? And again, we can use things like protein supplements and these other plant-based foods to cover that gap. So planning around that, I would say, is the most important thing whenever we're looking to transition. And then there's a few other kind of micronutrients that we need to be aware of. So things like B12. We know that we get B12 exclusively from animal-based products. And so this is where things like supplementation probably are required. We don't really, but it's the same, I would say, again, even for omnivorous athletes, things like vitamin D, we're going to have to supplement that anyway. We just can't get enough of it through food itself. And so if we can supplement with things like vitamin D, things like B12 are probably going to be necessary anyway. When it comes back to protein intake, mixing our sources. So we know that we can have kind of beans and lentils or legumes mixed, gives a different amino acid profile, and that can help with not just our overall protein intake, but also making sure that we're consuming an array of different amino acids can be really useful. And then the final consideration is probably iron intake. So one of the things that we can do is, purely just because of the absorption being lower in plant-based iron sources is to consume vitamin C with that. So essentially pairing foods high in iron, so like beans, nuts, fruits and vegetables, that kind of thing, with foods that are also high in vitamin C. So, and this is where there's a really good, there's two actually really good kind of day examples of meal plans on there's an ISSN journal that I'll fire over to you, and you can pin it in the podcast notes, where they give you a breakdown of, I think it's two diets, maybe 2,500, 3,500 calories. But it gives you a really good idea of like pairing different food sources together. So we know if we pair, say, if you're having an oatmeal breakfast, adding in some berries and some nuts, the nuts will obviously help with iron intake, but then the vitamin C also helps with that iron absorption. And so we can just pair meals a little bit. It just, I would say, is just planning a little bit better, where in a omnivorous diet, we can probably just eat the same meals over and over, or certainly similar meals over and over, which I know a lot of athletes do. I would say if you transition into a plant-based diet, we just need to be a little bit smarter about how we go to plan those meals.
When it comes to then looking at how an athlete can do that, and we make a practical example of it, can you talk us through a case study of someone who is on a vegetarian or vegan diet, and how that might look based around their training and their kind of like energy intake needs?
Yeah, so the key kind of principles stay more or less the same. So if we're thinking about the key meals being kind of before and after training, making sure that we're consuming enough carbohydrate, which is relatively straightforward if we think about the types of food that are available to athletes in terms of carbohydrate intake, and then protein intake after training, obviously being a key consideration, something that we want to try and promote muscle protein synthesis immediately after that training session. So one of the things that I always try and do is not steer too far away from what the athlete's already doing, and obviously try and work around their kind of lifestyle and what they've been doing previously, just to help that kind of adaptation phase going into a new kind of diet strategy. So there was one athlete we worked with who was one of the youth football players, and essentially the menu was kind of typically set where it would be normally eggs and toast for breakfast. They'd have a kind of a chicken breast with rice or potatoes, so carbohydrate source and vegetables for lunch, a protein shake after the gym in the afternoon, and then in the evening they would be like a family meal. So it might be spaghetti bolognese, it might be lasagna, etc. So one of the really simple ways we can do that is nothing needs to change dramatically, but we looked at the breakfast. So we might change the eggs out for like a scrambled tofu, works quite well. So we can get silken tofu and scramble that as a kind of egg replacement. We can look at something like swapping that for oatmeal, where we're still getting carbohydrate in there from the oats. We use a kind of soya milk, and we might add in a little bit of extra protein powder depending on what the protein needs are for the athlete, just to give the protein source. And then we can add in some nuts and seeds and fruit in there as well. So they're still, in terms of like the energy and the macronutrient standpoint, we're still looking to that to be comparable, but we're just giving them nice, easy options of how they can do that. Again, for the lunch, we can more or less keep that very similar. So the carbohydrate and the vegetable sources, or where they're getting those intake from, stay more or less the same. And then we just change essentially that protein source coming from a chicken breast. And then again, it might be something like in the short term, it might be something like a Quorn kind of breast that they do. we might look further down the line to look at something more like a homemade burger with some soya and beans, um, depending on what obviously the level of the athlete is and what their cooking skills and that kind of stuff is. And then the protein shake after kind of more or less stays the same. We're just using a plant-based alternative. And then into dinner, again, we can use in the immediate kind of period of transition, we can use things like swapping um, a kind of beef mince that they might use for a lasagna in for a kind of corn mince or a plant-based alternative. And again, further down the line, we might look to change that and include things like lentils or other kind of foods that we can just swap it out. But essentially, the idea is to maintain the same kind of nutritional profile as much as we possibly can, with an emphasis on obviously protein, but also making sure that the transition is easy enough for the athlete to kind of maintain that. We don't want to be making recommendations for them to overhaul everything and make some fancy meal that they don't know how to or they can't stick to. And so that's really where the kind of the focus is, keeping the nutritional profile as much as we can, but also not diverting too far away from what they're currently doing.
Absolutely excellent. I think that's a really interesting insight into how it can be done, and it doesn't have to be something big and scary, and you don't have to change everything in the world. But some small changes can obviously, make a bit of difference there. Sam, where can people find more information about you and what you're up to?
So I'm horrendous on social media. It's one of my goals for this year to get a little bit better. Um, but I do have Instagram. I can't actually remember what my email is.
It's a good resolution already, mate. You're doing well.
That's how little I actually use it. I think it might be Sam Thompson Nutrition, but I'll have to double check that and find out.
We'll put it in the show notes regardless. So if people want to follow you there, it'll be in the show notes.
And then I'm on Twitter or so whatever it's called now. Don't use it particularly often. But my plan is for this year to use it a bit more and connect with athletes and coaches and sports science and stuff. So, if anyone's interested in connecting, that'll be really good.
Excellent, mate. So massive thanks for your time on the podcast today. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate you having me on.
Cheers, buddy.
Bye.
And that's it once again. A massive thanks to Sam for all of his hard work on today's podcast. I really appreciate it. I'm sure you do at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. The Coach Academy is an overgrowing library of sports science courses which are broken down into bite-sized chunks. That means you can fit them in and around your busy coaching schedule. And of course, if you have enjoyed today's podcast, we can give you 7 days completely for free into the Coach Academy, where you can enjoy great courses, including ones from Sam himself on nutrition. So to get in there, you can hit the link in the show notes and get yourself 7 days of free Coach Academy in just a few seconds' time. And if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it would be fantastic if you could recommend us to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. That means that we can keep bringing you the best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, a massive thanks from me. I'm Matt Solomon for Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.